everyone, and welcome to another Half Pint session. Today, we're joined again by a former guest of the show, and he is the former host of the Unbelievable Debate program. He's an author. He's the co-host of the Re-Enchanting podcast, Mr. Justin Brierley. Hello, sir.
Thank you for having me back on, David. Love to be with you.
Yeah, it's actually been about a year and a half since we last touched base. The last time you had a book to shill, you reached out and said hello. Don't take it personally. But yeah,
I love you for more than
show,
just your book shilling purposes, David. Honestly, it's not just
obviously.
There's more to our relationship than that. Honestly.
Well, if nothing else, other than our shared Englishness. But unfortunately, I got bad news for you because since the last time you were on the show, I've become a US citizen. I'm still British. I still have the good passport, the one with a lion and a unicorn, not just this eagle nonsense. But what have you been up to since you were last here?
What have I been up to? Well, so I last would have come on to talk about the surprising rebirth of Belief in God book, which published about a year and a half ago. Since then, really, a lot of my life has been dominated by that book, but also a podcast series I launched based off the book of the same name, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, but more of a kind of very different to any podcast I've done before. It's more of a documentary podcast series, interviewing lots of different people, lots of different clips, music, narration, archive footage, and lots of things to kind of tell the story of why New Atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. So that's been a real interesting project. It's been fun because it's brought a lot of new listeners to my work and lots of interesting new conversations and because I think by God's grace I sort of somewhat anticipated something happening in culture. There's been a lot of interest around it because a lot of people have been seeing an openness to God and Christianity in places where they hadn't seen it before. So it's led to a lot of interesting conversations, and so continuing to do that, continuing to host as well the Re-Enchanting podcast that you mentioned, and even looking to sort of start to re-engage the whole area of moderating conversations and dialogues again. I'm looking to hopefully before the end of this year launch something in that space, which would be fun to get back in between people in conversations. So watch this space.
Well, you always did it very well. So I'm very pleased to hear that. But you're here now to talk about this book. And you told me before the show, this is actually the first time you've seen a copy of this thing.
It is. I don't have a physical copy of Why I'm Still a Christian yet. So it's really exciting. It looks very colourful. I'm glad it's come out so nicely.
It's very, very nice.
And it's essentially, the book is kind of taking those 20 years or so of conversations that I had with Christians and atheists and people of other faiths, the dialogues that I hosted, and kind of explaining where I stand. Because as a moderator of those debates for many years, a lot of people didn't necessarily know exactly how I put the pieces together. I mean, I never hid the fact I was a Christian, obviously, but one of the things that often was said, during that time when I was hosting all those shows was sometimes people would start listening to the podcast and not necessarily immediately twig that I was a Christian, because I was trying to do my best to be neutral and just host the conversations, let the guests do the talking. But inevitably, those conversations shaped the way I think about faith, the reasons for faith. And so the time came to put together a book where I really kind of explained where I stand on these issues, why I think Christianity makes sense. And so that's what the book is all about.
And one of the things that you talk about in the book is how you think that people are generally more open to having conversations about faith than we typically assume.
I think that's true.
And what do you base that argument? And also, why do you think that we typically think the opposite?
I think there's a certain kind of embarrassment we have. And I think it's often bred from the fact that Christianity, to some extent, has sort of had a bad rap in recent years. I think that new atheist vibe of the mid-2000s sort of led to a lot of people feeling a little bit embarrassed about Christianity. They'd been told it was anti-science. They'd been told it was anti-reason. and and so I think that sort of seeped into the general culture, and the kind of very sarcastic, dismissive approach to Christianity led to a lot of Christians feeling a little bit that they were on the back foot, I suppose. But at the same time, I mean, ironically, I think the New Atheism also helped sort of the rebirth to some extent of Christian apologetics. I mean, my own, the show that I hosted, Unbelievable, I don't think probably would have really existed in the way it did had it not been for the fact that there was this big set of thinkers offering these big objections against Christianity, and there was something to kind of engage. And so, and I think that's probably true of a lot of apologetics ministries of one sort or another. The fact that C.S. Lewis is so perennially popular is because, we need thinkers and we need apologists and we need those kinds of things actually for every season. And the New Atheism was very much one of them. But I do think people are more open than you might imagine, because once, I think, especially in recent years, I think as that New Atheist sort of stuff has died down, I think that people are kind of still basically asking the same questions they were before. Questions about meaning and purpose, identity. And I think in a way, the kind of the reasons for people to ask those have only become more pronounced in recent years. I think, I don't know, I just bump into more and more people who are growing dissatisfied with what the material account of reality can offer. More and more people who are dissatisfied with a purely secular outlook on life. People whose lives just aren't working out in the ways that, the promise of secular materialism, offered. And so I just, yeah, I find myself having more of these conversations now than I used to with people who are genuinely interested and open. Because yeah, it just seems to, it just feels, as I say, like things have opened up a bit, and it's not as hard as it used to be, maybe, to engage someone in a good conversation about God.
Also, historically, the things that you were told never to talk about in polite company were, religion and politics. And I think one of the gifts of the New Atheism was the fact that they made such a splash that it became news and something to talk about, and that therefore gave Christianity an opportunity to break through the crusty English veneer and actually address some of the complaints and criticisms from people like Dawkins.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in some ways it did give that permission to actually go and have these quite forthright conversations in a way about God. I don't know whether Dawkins ever anticipated, that he would, in a sense, play a part, I think, in the rejuvenation of Christianity, ironically, because I do think it was the kind of kick up the backside that in some ways crusty English people needed to go and start talking about God again. I think that the atheist bus campaign in London back in the mid 2000s was an absolute gift to Christians, because, atheist buses saying there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life, were like kind of an advert for God more than anything. It was like British people hardly needed reminding that, Christianity was irrelevant or not part of their lives. And yet these bus campaigns actually kind of did the opposite you know, in the message they proclaimed. It actually got people thinking about God in all kinds of ways, I think. So yeah, I agree. I think that it was interesting, that the ironic effect, if you like, that the New Atheism had on the whole conversation.
I think it prompted a lot of conversations,
Mm.
and the beginning of those conversations is, I think, something that Christians often feel very nervous about. I remember the very first evangelism book that I read. I did look in my library to find it. I must have lent it to somebody, but the front cover of it was how to make evangelism slightly less terrifying, or something like that. And it had people in these full bomb squad hazmat suits. But yeah, the bus campaign, it provided a prompt for
Yeah.
believing people to ask their neighbors what they thought about it.
Absolutely. And I think that there are often those kinds of prompts around us if you go looking for them. I've got a friend, Andy Bannister, who you may know as well, who's also written a great book on this, both a book on evangelism, but a more recent one called Simply Why, and it's more a question. It's more a book about sort of questions, and uh, and I think that's a great way into conversations is actually by asking questions. Have you ever wondered? I think that's the title of the book by Andy. And there are all kinds of interesting things that people are actually really open to talking about. People are quite often very open to talking about the things they're interested in, the things that drive their life, their longings, it might be family, it might be sport, it might be music, it might be some, uh, activism, some political cause. So there's loads of things that actually people are more than happy to talk about, and I just think all of them do actually present in all kinds of ways opportunities for that ultimately come back to the God question, even if that's not where you begin. Actually, when you dig into the reasons why people are fired up about these things, I think it can easily open the door to kind of the deeper questions then of, well, why is family so important to us? Where does that love come from, that you experience for your children that just seems so obvious and yet is hard to give a purely scientific account of, and that sort of thing. I think there are all kinds of different ways to start from where people are without it having to feel, awkward, um, in terms of starting a conversation. And I think some of the worst evangelism has inevitably come from that kind of tract based. His three things you have to say, to engineer a conversation in such a way. I just think, you need to start where people are and not turn it into some kind of a special project. Otherwise, that people immediately, I think, sense when they're kind of being sold something, if you know what I mean, in that way.
My personal favorite is when the thinnest link is taken and then it's used to jump to Christianity. It's like,
Yeah.
I see you're drinking some water there. Do you know who turned water into wine? Jesus. No, let me tell you. Da, 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 da.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've probably, tried that myself at various points earlier on in my Christian life. And that's not to say God can't use, our fairly poor attempts at evangelism, because goodness knows he has
If
to
he could
use them.
speak through an ass, he could even
Yes,
speak through me.
exactly. So I'd rather someone gave it a go and did a poor job than didn't try at all, so let's not, I'm not saying, that there's no fruit to be had from doing those things, but I think you can often build something up into something it doesn't need to be. And I think that's why the Unbelievable show itself was quite helpful. Obviously the guests coming on were coming to discuss something, so it wasn't like, you had to get around to the God conversation eventually, but I think it did help to at least model how to have conversations. And even the occasions when the Christian guest maybe did a not very good job of engaging the atheist guest, it was still a helpful lesson in how not to do it sometimes. And so whether it was a positive or negative kind of, encounter, I do think there was a lot of value in helping just people to see this is what conversations look like. And people, I think, I learned a lot, certainly, in the process of hosting those, and then kind of going and having similar conversations myself down the line.
I think at a fundamental level, everybody likes to be asked for their opinion. And so that's always a good way of getting a conversation going. Have you ever wondered, what do you think about such and such?
Mm.
But I think also everybody always wants to talk about the most essential things in life. And what I liked about your book is how you look at three aspects of humanity and say, these are best explained by God. And they're sort of really fundamental of human existence, purpose, and value. And really, every conversation has that at least at the back of it. If you're arguing for something, it's because you think that a mistreatment of human beings is bad. That prompts the question of why. If you're arguing for why we're here, well, that's the very fundamental question. How can people use these sorts of topics to approach the discussions of faith?
Yeah, I guess for me, I've always wanted to try and, rather than sort of make out that there's some slam dunk argument for Christianity, I've always seen it more as looking at different perspectives, different worldviews, and simply asking the question which best explains the evidence that's available to all of us. And I chose these three aspects of human reality, if you will, because I feel, especially when it comes to the conversation between atheism and Christianity, you are basically comparing two different accounts of the way things are and trying to give explanations for our shared experience. And in the process, I think Christianity comes off pretty well. It seems to explain, as far as I can see, a greater range of things. It's not that there are no questions or mysteries that we're left with, obviously, but it does seem to, overall, I've discovered it's a more coherent account of a whole range of things than a purely atheistic, naturalistic account of things. So, yeah, I focus on, first of all, human existence. And like you say, a lot of things come back to that. It is the classic question, why are we here? What caused us anything, in fact, to exist? And those are sort of obviously deep philosophical questions that have been asked from time immemorial. But I do think there's a real sense in which popular culture is often asking similar-ish questions to that, because it has become, the fact that the universe hasn't been around forever has kind of entered popular sort of currency, this idea of the Big Bang. And I think just that in itself is a really interesting place to begin in a conversation with someone. Isn't it strange? Have you ever wondered about the fact that all of this wasn't here just over 13.8 billion years ago? And that, just that mind-boggling fact that once all of physical reality, occupied a space the size of a golf ball, and just a fraction of a second before that, it occupied the space of a pea, and then you go just a fraction of a second earlier, and it appears as though there was literally nothing. That, and that alone, that kind of mind-boggling weirdness of our universe and what our best science tells us about it, I think is a really interesting conversation starter about the whole question of, well, where did physical reality come from then, if this is a sort of credible account of where everything came from. But then you've got, again, I just find this stuff, especially for some people who are wired this way, things like the fine-tuning of the universe for life, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but there are some people who find that absolutely fascinating, this idea that all of the constants and fundamental numbers that govern the laws of the universe are dialed to this extraordinary precision that seems to be just right to allow for the existence of life at some point in the universe. And as soon as that's usually, whenever I do a talk on these reasons, there's a little video I use, which kind of summarizes this argument of the fine tuning of the universe for life. And it's always that one that people are asking me about afterwards.
Is this the dice
Especially,
one?
yeah, the dice one, yeah.
I remember when
And
that one was released. Yeah.
yeah, and often it's I often find it's young men, interestingly, maybe engineers, people who kind of with a slightly more, those kinds of things. They're the ones who seem to suddenly, like, they latch onto that and like, oh, I've never thought of it like that. I've never heard anyone put it like that. And if you've been around the block in apologetic circles, you're more than likely to have bumped into the argument from fine tuning. But for people who perhaps haven't, it is quite a revelation. And they're like, oh, because I just assumed science kind of was either didn't have anything to say to faith, or was, actually somewhat anti the Bible or faith. And so to hear someone just saying, well, there's the best science that we have seems to indicate there's some kind of purpose in the universe, is genuinely a revelation. And so these are just some of the factors. You could add more to that. The very fact we can do science itself is either a remarkable fluke on an atheistic worldview, or actually speaks to the fact that we live in a universe that seems set up to allow us to discover it and map it out in physics and mathematics and that kind of thing. So there are lots of things that I think the fact that we're here, the fact we're able to some extent understand our place in the universe, is a rather remarkable and curious fact that seems to make more sense if there's a God than if there isn't a God. It none of it seems to really stack up probabilistically, if it's all down to chance. So that's the first one. Human existence seems to point towards God. But then going from looking out there at the cosmos to looking inside, I think the next one, human value, speaks to a slightly different way of thinking about humans. And that is, why do we believe in the inherent value and dignity of human beings? Why do we create whole documents of human rights? Why do we, have sort of debates about ethics and everything else? Now, there is I've encountered and talked with lots of atheists who maybe have a way of accounting for this on a purely atheistic worldview, but I've never really heard one that thoroughly satisfies me, because there's something about morality that can't simply be explained by the kind of benefits it brings at a purely kind of socio-evolutionary level. Obviously, there can be benefits at that level to certain ways of behaving that are cooperative and lead to the flourishing of tribes and so on. But that's not just describing morality that way doesn't really, I think, encapsulate what it means. There's actually something about morality that is actually about the way you should treat people. And that's different to simply describing the kind of moral norms that happen to have developed in a given time, place, and culture. And that's the difference for me between atheism and Christianity. I think Christianity can account for that, but atheism can't. It's this sense that there is an objectivity to morality, that there is an oughtness about life. And again, our friend C.S. Lewis was obviously the master in this area. And it was, of course, the argument that, moved him from atheism to theism, arguably. And I've always found it a very powerful argument myself, because it hits differently. It's often, in my experience, when people have been moved by what's often called the moral argument for God, it's when they've actually encountered real moral sort of justice or injustice in their life. And it's much harder to wave it away as simply the product of, purely natural forces, when you actually feel the injustice of someone killing your dearly beloved or something else. There's something much deeper seems to, I think, engage when you have, you have to ask yourself, where did this moral sense that seems to be so pervasive actually come from? And and I just think the idea that morality is somehow baked in to the reality of life, and therefore can't simply be the product of matter in motion and the laws of nature. I think it does, again, point beyond nature, points to a moral lawgiver. So that's the second one.
I think on that score, it's often said that we don't demonstrate the argument for morality so much in our actions, but in our reactions. It's when we are the one who has had an injustice done to us. It is very little comfort to say, well, there's no such thing as right and wrong, but you have just had something happen to you that you don't like. So it's like, no, I have been wronged. Yeah. There's something much deeper in your bones that just rejects such an assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in reality, I've often come across atheists who are quite logical, in their outworking of their materialist philosophy, to the extent that they might be a determinist, someone who thinks that actually everything in life is ultimately the product of a kind of inexorable process of cause and effect, and we don't really have any choice over even our actions or our beliefs, and certainly not morality, and yet the moment you walk out the door, the moment you stop this,
you act like that's not true.
You don't act. Yeah, so that's true. You act as if we really do have agency and free will, and people can be held to account for their actions. As soon as someone mugs you in the street, your kind of deterministic rationalistic philosophy kind of immediately takes a back seat. So I just think it's, at one level it's unlivable, but I think that should make us question whether it's true as well. And I just find that it's an argument that appeals far more, though, in a sense, to an intuition that these feelings I have about the way we should and shouldn't treat each other, they cannot just be the happenstance, as I say, of the hand that sociocultural forces of evolution have dealt me. Because they feel far more important than that. They feel true, in a way that account of reality does not see them as being true or false. So it's a a kind of as I say, that's why it hits differently. It's a kind of very personal kind of argument for.
And the final aspect of humanity.
So the final one, having talked about human existence, human values, human purpose, and again, I reach for good old C.S. Lewis again for this, because what I'm proposing is, I suppose, a version of the argument from Desire, which, he put so well, didn't he, when he said, I'm probably going to get the order wrong in this, but a baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Humans feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. And he says, if I find something which nothing in this world can satisfy, if I find in myself a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And I just find this a really helpful way of talking about the fact that we do have this kind of transcendent search for meaning and purpose across all times, places, and cultures. And the question is, well, is that search in vain? If we are just the products of a purely non-purposed, ultimately meaningless universe, is it just a massive sort of joke that sort of the universe has played on us, that the one place where we seem to look for meaning and purpose, there actually is nothing to be found? It's the one desire that won't be met by something true. And I, again, it's not in a sense a strictly philosophically logical argument. It's more a sense that, well, it's that sense that actually most people can't make sense of their life without there being a kind of a story, something that it's about. It feels like we need that search for meaning, that search for purpose. It just doesn't seem to sit well with most people if the actual story of the universe is that all of our hopes, dreams, and longings will one day be extinguished in the heat death of everything, and that it was all ultimately for nothing. Most people, I think, feel like, no, that doesn't feel like the story that I'm living in. So when Richard Dawkins says, the universe at bottom has precisely the properties we should expect if there is nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, and all the rest of it, in that famous quote, no goodness, no beauty, all the rest. I kind of look at the universe and I think, I don't know what universe Richard Dawkins is looking at, but most people don't see this universe of blind, pitiless indifference. They experience love, they experience beauty, they experience kind of things that just you can't boil down to chemicals in the brain. And there's a beautiful story I tell of, you may have come across her before, but there's a Catholic comedian now, and I'm trying to remember the name now off the top of my head. It's gone out of my head, but she's got a great story of coming to faith. Her story was that she was very much a sort of kind of confirmed atheist from childhood into her early adult years. And it was really only the experience of having a child that suddenly the lights went on for her, because it was the experience of looking down at this child and sort of thinking, well, what is it I'm experiencing with this child, this love for this child? Is it, at a purely atheist materialist perspective, it's just the fizzing of electrons in my brain creating this sense of love and everything. It can all be explained. And she looked at this child and she thought, that's not true. She just couldn't reconcile that idea that what she was feeling was just brain chemistry in the end. And that was the first step towards her becoming a Christian. And I just think that's true for many people, that there's just something about that atheist story of reality that just doesn't make sense in the end with our actual lived experience of meaning and purpose and love and beauty and everything else that we encounter.
Yeah, that was Jen Fulwiler, and
That's right, Jen
she
Fulwiler.
wrote a book that actually quotes Lewis in the title,
Yeah,
Something
there you
Other
go.
Than God.
There you go. There you go. Thank you for filling in that gap.
No worries, no worries. So, to sort of take us home, I agree with you. I think we're living in a moment. There's definitely been some sea changes that have been happening, but it's an opportunity for us to squander. So, what does the church have to do, in your opinion, to handle those who still have questions, those who are deconstructing, as well as those who are starting to ask those questions and are open to the questions of God and Jesus?
It's a great question. And I feel quite hopeful. I feel like there are opportunities opening up at the moment, in what has otherwise been feels like quite spiritually dry terrain, over the last several decades in the West. And to be honest, I would refer listeners to this book, and also, the previous book that we talked about, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, because that touches on similar areas, the way in which I think the church should lean into, and Christians can lean into, this new kind of openness that we're seeing. I do think that one of the dangers is to actually focus too much on apologetics. And again, one of our mutual heroes here, C.S. Lewis, was the master of actually doing both great apologetics, books like Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, and so on, but also infusing his literature and his fantasy novels with apologetics just bubbling below the surface, but making it so much more appealing to the imagination by casting it in a fantasy world, either science fiction or Narnia. And I think that's we're not, none of us are going to be a C.S. Lewis, but we can take a leaf out of his book when it comes to the way we engage our imagination, or engage people's imaginations in this whole process, which takes me back to that sort of whole piece that we were talking about earlier, about starting with people's deepest longings and dreams and the things that engage them, because that's where you'll kind of encounter their imagination. So for most people, I just don't think actually they're necessarily starting with a question about God necessarily. They're not necessarily asking for some evidence that God exists, or, 4 arguments for the resurrection or anything like that. They're starting from a very different place. But I do think all of those questions lead back to the God question and to the question of Jesus. It's just a case of engaging the imagination, so that, I love the way that Pascal put it, make good men wish that religion were true, and then show them that it is. And I think that's what Lewis did. He made people wish that Narnia really existed. He enchanted them with this land of good versus evil, and stories of bravery, and this, majestic, wise, but not tame lion. And by doing so, he kind of gave them sort of permission to imagine what the world would be like if it was like that. And then said, literally said, in the case of Lucy, well, maybe you must know me by another name. What if this world really is true in your experience? And it's not just a fantasy in that sense. And I think there's something about that imperative that we need to take on board, that we have to engage people's imagination through our literature, poetry, film, all of the things that are at our disposal, good storytelling, basically, of one kind or another, because that's actually where I think the journey begins to faith, is when you've kind of got them in the imagination. And then you may find important questions around apologetics and how we make sense of this and the historical record and everything else may be important. But if you don't start with the imagination, for most people, I think you don't get anywhere, because there's kind of no reason why they would particularly need it to be true or desire for it to be true. So that's kind of something that I've been trying to do myself, almost by not dispensing with the classic kind of apologetic debate format. I think there's always going to be a place for that. But the new season, the new podcast, the Surprising Rebirth podcast, I genuinely was trying to do something that felt a bit more like taking people on a journey, that was more of an experience, and spoke to more than just a kind of logic and reason, but kind of engaged story and imagination, and helped to sort of weave something that's a little bit more, right-brained, for want of a better word, than just left-brained,
This season on the podcast, we've been reading through Perelandra. And one of the themes that keeps coming up in that book, we're just finishing it now, is the fact that the world, and specifically on the planet Venus, is bigger than you have ever conceived of. Ransom, as he goes through all of his adventures, he discovers that the universe is much more populated with so many more weird and wonderful things than he'd ever even conceived of before. And I think the one thing that the church needs to do is to be able to invite people into a bigger world, to show them that science and faith are not at odds. In fact, it actually points to a bigger world under this conception. It's actually one of the arguments in miracles. It's like the Christian is more open-minded, because someone who's a strict materialist has to cut that out. The Christian lives in a bigger world. And I love your answer about the arts as well, whether visual, musical, or storytelling, to show people that the Christianity offers a richness in stark contrast to what you've said has happened to new atheism, which is namely that, well, it all just seems a little shallow and a little boring and unexciting. And that was actually something Lewis said himself when he was struggling with faith. He said, all of the people, all the books that I should have been agreeing with, they just felt shallow and empty and didn't excite me or interest me. It was the theists and the polytheists that really got him going.
Yeah. He literally describes it almost as the two halves of his brain. I think almost anticipating that sort of left-right hemispheric approach. He said, on the one half was this rationalistic, glib, shallow kind of rationalism, but that he just found so dull and uninteresting. And on the other side, this many islanded sea, wasn't it, of myth and storytelling and so on, but that he couldn't accept was true, and he was caught in between these two. And obviously, to some extent, it was his friend J.R. Tolkien who helped him to bridge those two hemispheres and realize that actually he doesn't have to jettison reason in order to kind of see that actually there is a God who, the ultimate storyteller, through whom all of those myths are somehow, are ultimately met in Jesus Christ. So, yeah, I mean, you just can't, you can't beat Lewis for this kind of stuff. He was talking about the same things we're now talking about, 100 years ago, and I just constantly go back to him. Honestly, I'm usually reading some kind of Lewis, 2 or 3 books a year, and I just find it's just like, why wouldn't you? Because anyone else you're reading, me included, we're basically just paraphrasing and recycling Lewis at some point along the line. Do you know what I mean? It's kind
Didn't want to say it out loud.
I know. But let's be honest about this. So you might as well go back to but that, having said that, there are good apologetics books that have been written since C.S. Lewis. But no, it's just, he was the master. I do think, though, genuinely, that these things do come around, and that it's often been said, oh, we need another C.S. Lewis for our time and so on. But I'm quite encouraged to see the way in which there has been a real renaissance, to some extent, of really good creative Christians doing art, like taking it seriously now, not just as a sort of prop for evangelism, but just
Let's slap Jesus on here somewhere.
yeah, exactly. But doing, I would, for instance, say that The Chosen, although it is more explicitly Christian, obviously, and it's actually a really good piece of storytelling, well done, artistically, kind of credible, and I think one of the reasons it's had such an effect, and has done so well, is because it does storytelling well, and it does art well, and so on. And I'm glad to see some of those kind of things coming out from Christians, but equally lots of great artists who are not necessarily kind of wearing the Christian label, but for who I'm increasingly seeing are evidently very influenced by Christian motifs and themes and that kind of thing. Hearing from people like Nick Cave, the Australian musician, rock artist, who, you can just see the way in which his reawakening to Christian faith is just coming through in so many ways in his music and his art. I just think that we might be standing on the verge of some really good sort of C.S. Lewis like kind of artists who are starting to share faith in those kinds of ways through really good art and literature and music and so on.
So there you have it. If you buy one book today, make it a C.S. Lewis book. But if you do want to go for another one, this one's pretty good too. Justin, thank you for coming on the show. Where can people buy the book? Where should they go and find you, listen to you, all that good stuff?
Yeah. So Why I'm Still a Christian is published by Tyndale. You can find it wherever books are sold, hopefully. If you want more from me, justinbrierley.com is the place to go. You can find links there to books, to the podcasts that have been mentioned, other resources. And yeah, that's the place to go.
Wonderful stuff. And viewers, please join us again next time. We'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.